Well, we are, as you've already figured out, we are studying the book of Romans right now. And part of the reason why we're studying this book is that it takes us deep into the Christian gospel itself. For far too many of us, our experience of Christianity, if we're honest, is really a fairly shallow experience. It's shallow in that our experience with God doesn't seem to quite hit the way we think it ought to. It's also shallow for many of us in that our understanding seems to be a bit thin about what the Christian gospel actually says about who Jesus is and why he matters and why his message is important for us today. And so what Romans does and what the Apostle Paul does, who wrote the book of Romans, is he opens up the hood of the Christian gospel, as it were, and allows us to take a journey with him into the very inner workings of the guts of Christianity and the very core message of Jesus. And so if you are a Christian, it's important to study this book because it allows you to benefit from and to enjoy the fruits of the depth of what the Christian gospel actually is. Martin Luther, he said this about Romans. He says that Romans can be continuously fed off of. And every time he went back to Romans, he found that he became full from its fruits. And so if you're a Christian, studying this book is good for us because Romans has an inextinguishable character to it as a book that we can feed off of and grow as Christians. If you're here and you're just checking out Christianity, you're not quite a Christian, or you're just kind of checking out what Jesus had to say, the book of Romans is very good for you too because it allows you to take a cold, hard, long look at the guts of Christianity and be able to sort of assess it based on this terrific explanation of the gospel itself. And so that's why we are studying this book. And what we've learned so far, we've learned a few things, but one of the things we've learned so far is that the Apostle Paul is a very deliberate writer. He's a very gifted, skilled writer. And yet the way he writes is not like the way a bricklayer lays bricks. A bricklayer lays bricks one beside the other, and then systematically goes and lays it one beside the other and beside the other. Paul doesn't write concept neatly on top of concept, on top of concept, on top of concept. Paul instead writes more like a great artist, in which he paints beautiful broad strokes and then he kind of fills in some detail here and there, and then he paints a broad stroke about a different topic and he fills in the details here, and then sometimes he's talking about a topic and then he goes back suddenly and goes to a different topic, and then the effect of it is that after a while, if you keep reading him, this beautiful image begins to appear and you begin to see the big idea that Paul is writing about. So he writes like a great artist. And to respect the reality of that and the way Paul writes, what we did last week was we kind of skipped to the end of his first major section, which is in chapter 3. And we wanted to give you kind of the end game, the punchline, the main picture that Paul is trying to paint for us so that we can get a good look at that. And then today and next week, we're actually going to work backwards from that to see where Paul got there. But last week, we saw kind of the big picture that Paul is trying to paint for us is explained really well in Romans chapter 3, verse 23 and 24. And we have it here. We'll just look at it briefly to see kind of what the big picture was. Here it comes. Oh, yeah. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and are justified by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus. Sometimes we call this justification by faith. To be justified means to be made right in our standing before God. You see, all of us have sinned and stand guilty before God. And that guilt that we feel is that thing that causes us to feel separated from God, to feel distant from Him. Sometimes there's animosity that we feel between us and God. And to be justified means to be made right. And in order for us to be made right before God, something has to be done with our guilt. And that's precisely what Jesus did. He took that guilt that was on us and He took it into Himself. So by Him taking on our guilt and dying for us, He redeemed us. And so by placing our faith in Him, our trust in Him and what He's done, we are justified. Justification by faith. So that's the core of what we talked about last week. If you have a chance, I would encourage you, if you didn't listen to last week's sermon, to go online this week on our website and to listen to last week's sermon. It was a very good explanation of justification by faith. Please go and look back on that. What we're going to do today is to say, now in light of this justification by faith, we're going to ask this question: how did Paul get there? And we're now going to study the section right before the section we talked about last week. We're going to work backwards a little bit. And what Paul does in Romans 3, verses 9 through 20, is he begins to explain why the most fundamental alternative to the gospel doesn't work. In fact, this alternative to the gospel is probably what most people in this city settle for instead of this justification by faith. In fact, this alternative to the gospel is what many people go to church for. This alternative to the gospel goes something like this: I need a tool to help assist me in becoming a better person. I'm basically a good person. I don't do many things that are bad. I'm a good husband, more or less, pretty decent to my kids. Some of you think, I'm a good coworker, I'm honest, more or less, and certainly when I compare myself to those other people who are less honest and less good than I am, then I'm actually feeling pretty good about myself. It is this idea that we are basically okay before God, and if we examine our lives, we're basically okay. Sure, I'm no Mother Teresa, but overall, I'm a good person. And what Paul is going to explain in this section is he is going to deconstruct this alternative and explain why that doesn't work. He's going to show us that it doesn't work in two different areas. He's going to show us it doesn't work if we take an honest look at human history, and he's going to say it doesn't work if we take an honest look at our own soul, at our own heart. From time to time, I do laundry in our house. And when I say from time to time, I mean like maybe once or twice a year. And there are lots of reasons why I don't do laundry. But one of the reasons why is that every time it seems I do laundry, I tend to do something wrong and destroy clothes in our house. The last time I did laundry, something weird happened. It turns out when you do the laundry and it washes, that you have like a certain time frame between when it washes and when you put it in the dryer. And that if you wait 72 hours between the washing and the drying, it doesn't matter how neatly you fold the clothes or how well you iron it or how much cologne you put on, you're going to smell sour. And people are going to walk past you and have that weird turn of the head and go, there's something wrong with that person. He stinks. Paul is going to say that there is a reality to the human condition in which something is interwoven into who we are. There is a brokenness, a corruption that is a reality of being human that manifests itself in that everything that we do, there is a touch of corruption, of sin. It doesn't mean that everything we do is totally evil or bad. Of course, there are good things that people do. But what he's going to say is that if we look closely, you can see something is off. And that's what Romans 3, verse 9, what Paul begins to explain. And so let's look at 3, verse 9, and what we're going to see is Paul explained this fundamental thing that's wrong with us, and then he's going to keep explaining why that thing is wrong with us impacts everything that we do. So 3 verse 9 says this: what then? Are we Jews any better off? No, not at all. For we have already charged that all, both Jews and Greeks, which is a way of saying all humans, are under sin. To be under something, how Paul uses it, is to be under the power or influence of someone else. In fact, the language that Paul uses here of Jews and Greeks, all humanity being under sin, he is borrowing that from Greco-Roman slavery language, in which a slave was under the influence, power of one's master. Paul describes it, sin, as a master and us as the slaves in various ways. Look at Romans 7:14. We have this. It says, for we know that the law is spiritual, but I am of the flesh, sold under sin. Again, slavery language here, to be sold under someone else's, some other power that has authority over me. Elsewhere in Romans 6, Paul puts it this way: do you not know that if you present yourself to anyone as obedient slaves, you are slaves of the one whom you obey, either of sin, which leads to death, or of obedience, which leads to life? And so Paul says, if you want to know who you really answer to, the answer to that question is, who do you really obey fundamentally? And he said, who you obey is your master. They have influence and control over you. Let's talk a little bit about how slavery worked in Greco-Roman society, because it functioned quite different than the scar of slavery that mars our own country's history. Slavery in the first century Greco-Roman world looked significantly different in that the largest class of slaves in Rome were these class of individuals that were called, ironically, freedmen. F-R-E-E-D-M-E-N, freedmen. This is as opposed to free men, which are F-R-E-E-M-E-N. But this class of slaves called the freedmen, it worked very strange, because if you were a freedman, you were given some room to roam. In fact, you were freed. That is, freed to do whatever it is your master wanted you to do. And so if it behooved the master to have his slave go get educated, he would go get educated. If it behooved him to go become a master himself in business dealings, he would allow him to do so. The insidious thing about how slavery worked in the first century is that slavery just worked itself into society so that you couldn't really tell who slaves were. Except someone who was a freedman knew at any given moment, at any given time, their master could come to them and say, I own you. This is what you have to do. And this is what you have to do. And what Paul is saying is that there is a fundamental reality with humanity in which, because of what we see in the very beginning of this story of human history and Genesis, very beginning of Genesis, where Adam and Eve fall into sin, they fall into the power and dominion of sin, and they ultimately answer to it. And what does sin do? Sin is a horrible master. It ultimately breaks you down, brings in decay, it lies, it gives half-truths, and ultimately it leads to death. And Paul says that we are all alike and that we are all under this mastery of sin. And we all do its bidding. And so while it may seem as if we sort of kind of can blend in the crowd, so to speak, the reality is that when it comes calling, we answer to it. It is the dark passenger in the seat next to us. And when it calls, we answer. And so that is his explanation of this reality, that we are under sin. What's his thesis? What does this mean? Let's keep reading. What then? Are we Jews any better off? No, not at all, for we have already charged that all, both Jews and Greeks, are under sin. Verse 10, as it is written, here's his thesis, none is righteous. No, not one. No one is righteous. And he says, as it is written, because he's getting ready to give us a bouquet of Old Testament quotes that he has kind of selectively put together in this section from verse 10 all the way to verse 18. And many of these quotes that he chooses from the Old Testament were written 1,000 years earlier. And so there have been 1,000 years of history by the time Paul quotes these texts and when they were actually written. And the thesis of this quotation is that none are righteous. No, not one. No one really understands. No one even really seeks for God. One of the towering intellects of the 20th century was a German man by the name of Karl Barth. Enormously influential. And what was interesting about him was he was a young man beginning his academic career in between World War I and World War II. And as he was teaching and his influence began to grow intellectually, he began to speak out against this growing movement within his Germany of Nazism. He began to speak out against it. And he began to see many of his friends, many people that he respected, many smart, super smart people began to get sucked up into this movement of Nazism. It got so bad for him that he began to speak out publicly, and so the German officials escorted him out of Germany, and he had to finish his career in Switzerland. And Barth wrote this about human history on the heels of the horrors of what happened at the hands of his home country. He says, the whole course of history pronounces this indictment against itself. How can a man be called historically minded if he overlooks it? If all the great outstanding figures in history whose judgments are worthy of serious consideration, if all the prophets, psalmists, philosophers, fathers of the church, reformers, poets, artists were asked their opinion, would one of them assert that men were good? What then does history teach about the things which men do or do not do? Does it teach that some men at least are like God? No, but that there is none righteous. No, not one. And what Barth writes there is what Paul is arguing is a universal human phenomenon. That if we observe our own paths, we come to this conclusion that debunks this alternative gospel that we are not as bad as we think we are. That our righteousness is pretty good. Actually, all of human history, both biblical leading up until now, says the opposite. That none really are righteous. No, not one. Well, in what ways does our unrighteousness get flushed out? And now what Paul is going to begin to do, he's sort of creating for us this courtroom imagery. We humans, all of humans, regardless of our traditions or whatever, we're all sort of the defendants. And now Paul is going to kind of state this case against us. He stated the big problem that we are all sold under sin, that we are all answering to sin, which causes brokenness and decay in our own hearts and souls. That leads to unrighteousness. And now he's going to lay out a case of how this unrighteousness actually fleshes out in our lives. He's going to talk about our deeds. He's going to talk about our minds. He's going to talk about even our search for God. Let's see what he does here. No one is righteous, no, not one. No one understands. No one understands. He's going to say that our minds, our thoughts aren't even straight. That when we are thinking about ourselves and we're thinking about our relationship with God, our relationship with other people, we stand from a perspective that is fundamentally uneven. And so regardless of how clear it seems we might be able to perceive the truth, we don't even perceive it properly. So that's one of the things that sin does. Sin actually comes in as a myriad of half-truths that cloud our thinking so that we can't even get our minds right on something. About 2 years ago, had some friends who built in our backyard this enormous sandbox, which is cool, and have these little kids. And when they built it and we put all this fresh sand in it, we noticed this phenomenon with especially our littlest kids, is that for our littlest ones, they were really frustrated by it. The reason why they were frustrated is because the older brother had hit a matchbox car or a marble or something deep into the sand. And the littlest ones began to dig into the sand. It was hot, dry sand. And they became frustrated because when they began to dig, searching for this marble that was deep underneath the sand, as soon as they digged a small hole, it would fill in with all the other sand. And they would dig and they would dig and they would dig, but it was useless because the sand kept filling in over and over and over again. And what Paul is saying is that our minds work like that. And that's sort of how our understanding functions. That it seems as if we're going after something that's really true and we're trying to get full understanding and knowledge of it. But the reality is that our minds are flooded with half-truths. So we never really get a true understanding of a thing. No one understands. No one seeks for God. All have turned aside. Together they have become worthless. No one, get this, now he's going to talk about what we do. No one does good, not even one. Skip down to verse 15. Their feet, again, what we're doing, their feet are swift to shed blood. In their paths are ruin and misery. In the way of peace they have not known. Here, especially in verse 16, where it says, in their paths are ruin and misery, he's talking about the fact that everywhere you go, it seems that corruption follows. That everywhere you go, even when you go away from a bad situation, it seems like after a while, corruption begins to emerge. It's interesting, if you study some of the history of this city of Denver, we know that obviously this city is not enormously old, and so everyone really is from somewhere else fundamentally. But one of the things that caused Denver to grow and to continue to grow is that people move from somewhere else with the hopes of having a fresh start. And so you move here from back east because you want to get away from the stuffiness and from the institutions of the east, or you move here away from the south because you're tired of the conservative culture and the religion that's over there. And people move here from California because they're tired of the money and they want to go and they want to relax a little bit more and have better traffic. And everything's fine and dandy for about 6 months or a year and a half. And then they begin to realize that some of the same things that plagued them back where they're from begins to emerge right here. Because fundamentally the problem that we experience is not those people over there. There's a problem that we experience in us, so that no matter where we go, how does Paul put it? Our paths are ruin and misery. They follow us. Church people have experienced this. I spent 10 days on vacation, and where else would you want to go on a 10-day vacation but Oklahoma? And which is where I'm from, and I kind of grew up in this really conservative culture in which there was this desire to separate away from all of the liberals and all of the Democrats, and it's funny. And they wanted to separate away from all of those bad people and create their own little sects of just right people. And the story that you hear over and over and over again there and anyone else and with any other society in which you separate yourself out from other people is that the problem emerges from within. That the problem isn't those people out there. It's always follows us. And the reason why it follows us, we see here, verse 13, Paul is going to talk about our mouths, what we say, what comes out of our mouth. Notice the language he uses, verse 13. Their throat is an open grave. They use their tongues to deceive. The venom of asp is under their lips. Their mouth is full of curses and bitterness. Here Paul is describing all of the physical functions that are involved with speaking. And he's saying if we examine what it is that comes out of our mouths, it will give us a diagnosis of something more than just the words. He here is talking now about what Jesus talked about when he said that what comes out of the mouth actually comes from the heart. And what James talked about in the book of James, that what comes out of the tongue, out of the mouth, actually is a picture of the human heart. And that if we removed all of the filters that we have built into our minds to filter our words, that if we removed all of those filters, what would come out, Paul says, is this picture of your throat is an open grave. It may sound kind of over the top, and in some ways, sort of his language here is meant to kind of shock us a little bit. But the reality is, the more we talk and the more honest we get, he says, his argument is that it shows our heart to be more and more broken, to be more and more corrupt. If you don't believe me, I encourage you to hang out with small children who society has yet to build in them this filter with their words. And they will come right up to you and say, you know what, you're fat. And they'll come right up and say, what's wrong with your face? and not think anything of it. Or if you hang out with people who are older people, they're too tired and worn down to worry about that filter anymore. And they will tell it to you exactly how they see it. And what Paul says is that when our mouths, when we begin to speak and it's totally unfiltered, what is revealed is actually a dark heart. Our hearts, our understanding, our deeds, and even our quest for God. Verse 11, no one understands, no one seeks for God. Verse 18, there is no fear of God before their eyes. Now, you may be thinking, well, that's not exactly true, is it? I mean, a basic course of anthropology teaches us that all of human history is a history of people seeking after God of some sort. I mean, lots of people come here every week who are in some ways seeking God. What's Paul talking about here? What he's talking about is that there is a sense in which people seek for God, but it's not seeking God for him. It's seeking what God can do for you. It's seeking the benefits that is available with him, that if somehow I'm able to connect into this being, this reality of who God is, then maybe he can do something about my life or my situation. Paul says, if we look closely, no one really seeks for God to know him as he is. They seek him because they want something from him. I have a little 2-year-old boy named Beckett who is just as cute as can be. He has dimples, and he's really vivacious and fun, but you should never let his cuteness, don't let him fool you by the cuteness. And what he's been doing to me for the past about a month and a half is something that's pretty interesting. He'll come up to me, and he's done this to some of you who ever babysat for him. He'll come up to you, he'll begin to smile, he'll begin to even hold your leg, and then he'll look up to you with his big, just baby eyes, and he'll hold me. And it's pretty much irresistible. And so you hold him, and as you're picking him up, he begins to lean forward, point out his finger, and begin to go, I want. And you begin to realize that he wasn't looking for some cuddle time, just some dad-son time. He wasn't looking for that. No, what he realized is that I'm bigger than him. And I can reach into the freezer where the popsicles are. I can reach the top shelf in our room where the kids' movies are. And he can't get to them without me. And what Paul is saying is that if you sort of boil down our search for God in terms of our human history and our search to seek out God, he says what actually is revealed is not a desire to understand God in his own terms, but that there is a twist to this, that we want what God can provide. So, Paul lays out his case against us. He says that we are all, humans are under the power of sin, and that sin has corrupted everything that we do. Not that everything comes out as purely corrupt, but that there is a tinge, there is some harm, there is some perversion in everything that we do, say, even our search for God itself. And what he wants to now create in us is this that we see in verse 19. Now we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be stopped, and the whole world may be held accountable to God. What it means that every mouth may be stopped, he's actually now evoking an image of a courtroom after the lawyer has made a convincing case against the defendant. In fact, it's this picture where the evidence against the defendant is so overwhelming, his guilt is so obvious, that the only thing for the defendant to do is symbolically cover his mouth, cover her mouth. And it is their way of acknowledging their guilt before the court and before the judge. And what Paul is hoping to achieve in this passage is to do the same thing with us. To peel back this facade of goodness that we get really skilled in fashioning around ourselves, to peel it back, to allow the reality of our own brokenness to be revealed. And to get to the point where we run out of all the, but are silent. And we shut up before God and acknowledge our guilt. The second thing he wants us to do is to realize that we are fundamentally, our mouths are shut before him and that we are guilty as charged. The second thing he wants us to do is to look around and to realize that this is a human indictment against all of us. Every tribe, every culture, every tradition, that there is not one that stands above the other in judgment, but that all are guilty. This is really difficult for Paul to learn because he grew up in a context in which he was the smartest, in which he was the most religious, the most righteous. He was the superstar. And he had a real fervor for God and doing what was right as he saw it. And he saw himself over all those pagans, all of those unrighteous people, until he realized that he was as guilty as they. That's why when you see in his writings, oftentimes when he has a list of sinners and vices, he ends that list by saying, "Of whom I am the worst," or the chief, or the foremost. Because he realized this fundamental quality of this universality, universal guilt that we stand before God. It means that we are all equally guilty before him. There is an equality there. Now, what does a defendant do who has acknowledged his guilt, who has shut his mouth, and realized that the very judge who's presiding over his case is the one whom he has offended? What does that defendant do? Nothing. Nothing. And when you get to the point where you realize you stand guilty and you can do nothing about it, then you're ready for the gospel. We are in total need for God to do something. See how Paul puts it in Galatians 4. We are in need of God to act. How does he act? How does he take the first step? Since we can't, we are condemned, we're guilty. But when the fullness of time had come, God, he acted. God sent forth his son, born of a woman, born in the flesh that you and I share, born under the law, the same standard of the law. Yet he does it perfectly. What does he do? To redeem, to buy back those who were under the law. This is now slavery language of buying back someone who was lost, who was in charge of someone else, to redeem those who are under the law so that we might receive adoption as sons, as daughters. Because you are sons, God has sent his Spirit, the Spirit of his Son, into your hearts, crying, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but a son. And if a son, then an heir through God. When we begin to take to heart and realize what God offers us in Jesus Christ, that we are fundamentally guilty before God, and an honest evaluation of our soul and of history says that we are. We now look to Jesus, who at the cross, he broke a power. You see, how do you break this power of sin that is over us? We can't do it. We've proven that. But what do? You go to someone who can. Jesus at the cross in the flesh broke the power of sin and of death. So that by faith, by trusting in what Jesus has done, our guilt, which is manifold, is transferred to him. He takes it, and we get instead his righteousness, so that we can even call God our Father. And we can realize that we are his son, his daughter. And what does a son and a daughter do? After a while, they begin to share the characteristics of their father. And the reality begins to set in when people acknowledge and join themselves into Jesus and trust in him and take his righteousness. That as life begins to progress, something is born into their hearts, in which a new nature begins to emerge, in which you have a desire to seek God for God. And you have a desire to follow after him and do deeds that are not in trying to earn righteousness, but because God has changed your heart slowly but surely into the heart of his own children. So that the very areas of brokenness that stand in guilt, that we stand in guilt, God through Jesus begins to touch those areas of brokenness and begins to bring life and newness and a new creation that we begin to experience. But you can't have that until you come into the courtroom and your mouth is shut and you've run out of yourself and you've quit all the yeah buts, and you say, I'm in fundamental need of someone else to act. Let's pray. Father, I pray that your Spirit would be at work right now in our hearts. And I pray that you would allow us to realize that none is righteous, no, not one. I pray we would come to the end of our excuses and acknowledge our guilt. And God, I pray that we would turn to Jesus anew. For those who have been Christians for a long time, I pray they would turn afresh to Jesus and recognize the righteousness that they have been given, and that Jesus bears their guilt and that he took it. And God, I pray for friends who are still processing all of this. It's a lot to take in. God, I pray, though, that they would begin to come to the end of themselves, and they would realize that they're in fundamental need of you to act. And God, I pray when that time happens, they would turn to Jesus and see him as their Savior, as their remedy. I pray this in Christ's name. Amen.